Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our series of events for Imposter Syndrome Awareness Day. We've had a great morning of webinars, Q&As and conversations around the phenomenon of imposter syndrome. I'm really trying to just open up that conversation about it and talk about it more openly. And we've seen some really, really good chats and conversations going on our social media channels. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Kim Meninger. She is a leadership coach and consultant, and she's going to be talking to us this afternoon about conquering imposter syndrome to advance your career. So welcome, Kim. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. To give you a little bit of background on me, I tend to describe the work that I do as a leadership coach and consultant as primarily focused on helping people to navigate what makes it hard to be human in the workplace. There are a lot of resources available to help us develop competencies and skills in different areas, but I tend to look at it through the lens of what do I do if I know what I'm quote unquote supposed to be doing, but I feel like an imposter, or I have a lot of anxiety, or I don't feel psychologically safe enough to take risks or to connect with my team. And so I try to reveal the messy human side of the workplace experience and provide very actionable strategies and tools that you can use to be more confident in your workplace. I used to work in high tech. I spent over half my career in the high tech space before I started my own business. And so I know very well the challenges of working in dynamic, complex environments. Imposter syndrome is a very important topic to me because it's near and dear to my heart. It was a very long part of I would say, a constant companion during my time in the high tech industry in particular. And I think it's an important topic for us to be discussing. There is more conversation these days than ever about imposter syndrome, but it remains very stigmatized. People still tend to feel uncomfortable sharing. And so we often walk around carrying it with us like it's a deep, dark secret. We feel like we're the only ones who feel this way. We look around and we think everyone else has it all figured out. There must be something wrong with me. So conversations like these are really important because it gives us an opportunity to normalize it, to recognize that this happens to more of us than not. And also, again, to be able to have some very specific things that we can do about it. I want to share a little bit of my story before we jump in today. I have a psychology degree. I stumbled into the high tech industry a couple of years after graduating from college. I had no plans of ever being part of the corporate world, ever going into the business sector. But I had decided not to go into a PhD program, which had been my lifelong dream. I was looking for a job, and it was at a time when the jobs were readily available. And so I took a leap of faith and found myself at a big high tech company. And there were parts of it that really spoke to me because I have that natural curiosity about humans, and I was really good at the people side of business. I found it much easier to navigate some of the relationship building, trust building, navigating politics side of business. But I also found myself surrounded by people who were engineers and product managers, very technical people who, to me, it felt like they were speaking a language that I didn't understand. And I would get into meetings and I would feel like I was one question away from the whole house of cards collapsing, that it was only a matter of time before everyone realized I had no business being in this room with these people. And it was incredibly anxiety provoking. And it went on for a very long time. And I'm going to share with you today some of the strategies that I used and some of the strategies that I coach others to use to really try to prevent, minimize, manage this experience. There are a lot of conversations about imposter syndrome, but I don't think that many of them get to the what do I actually do about it that's realistic and easy to put into action. So that's my goal for today. I really want to encourage you to feel free to share your questions. I will get to as many of them as possible. And with that, I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. I'm going to share some slides with you all. And we will jump in. I do want to apologize in advance for the fact that these are all very female centric images. I tend to give this presentation to women's groups within organizations. However, everything that we're talking about today has universal relevance regardless of your gender. So hopefully you'll stick with me here. I always like to start with a set of statements that reflect the experience of imposter syndrome and invite you to reflect on your own about whether or not any of these statements resonate with you. And it could be something that you're feeling right this very moment, or it could be something that you've experienced at some point throughout your career and your life. And I'll read them here. The first is, my success is a result of luck and timing, not my skills and efforts. Others are going to find out that I'm not as good as they think I am. I've inadvertently deceived people into thinking I can do this job. I feel undeserving of my success. At any moment, I may be exposed as a fraud. So these are often the thoughts that run through our heads when we experience imposter syndrome. And if this sounds familiar to you, you are not alone. Research shows that approximately 70% of the population will experience imposter syndrome at some point. And more recent studies have shown that that number may be even higher, particularly given the disruption, the volatility, the changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic that have really thrown us into a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about our jobs and our lives more generally. So you are absolutely in good company if this sounds like your experience. So what is imposter syndrome? And many of you are probably familiar with this term, but for those of you who are not, or maybe you don't have a lot of background on the topic, I want to make sure that we're on the same page with with regard to what we're going to be talking about today. Imposter syndrome was first studied and defined by a couple of female psychologists back in the late 1970s in the United States. And they were looking at a fairly non-diverse group of female graduate students. And they coined the term originally imposter phenomenon. It has since evolved into the phrase imposter syndrome, which we use today. But back then, how they described it was these feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy that we have, despite the fact that to the outside world, everything looks great. We're meeting our goals, we're getting great feedback. On paper, everything looks fine. But inside, there's this disconnect. And it feels like it's only a matter of time before everyone figures out that I don't belong here. What's interesting about imposter syndrome is that it often strikes high achievers. It's the people you least expect to struggle with self-doubt because they tend to have long track records of success. However, if you start to look further into what triggers imposter syndrome, it begins to make sense because one of the primary triggers of imposter syndrome is change. It's stepping outside of our comfort zone. It's doing something new for the first time. And when we do that, we feel so aware of everything that we don't know. We are often used to being really good at our jobs. Once we get into it, we become very reliable resources. We get really comfortable with our work. And then we take a new step, whether that's taking on additional responsibility, getting promoted to the next level. And we suddenly start comparing ourselves to other people and thinking, these people are so much smarter than I am. I don't belong in this room. And the reality is that high achievers tend to do this more often than others. They're more likely to take those steps and stretch themselves and take those risks. If you worked in the same job for 20 years and there was nothing challenging to you anymore, nothing was new, then there's not really any type of a trigger there for imposter syndrome. It's really about how do you approach new challenges and opportunities. What's also interesting about imposter syndrome is that for many years, the assumption was that it only affected women. much of the early research was done only with women. And so it's relatively recently that the research has expanded to show that it is a gender agnostic experience. You can experience imposter syndrome regardless of your gender. However, it tends to strike people who feel different from the dominant culture more often. So this is why we tend to see it in women in traditionally male dominated spaces. We see it in people of color. We see it in anybody who feels different, underrepresented, right? And it might be something as simple as being the only introvert on a team of extroverts. Whenever we feel different because of our natural desire as humans to conform to our environments, to belong to our environments, we end up with that self-doubt and we internalize that as there must be something wrong with me. I should be more like these other people. So what does it look like? What are some of the manifestations of imposter syndrome? I think that's important here for two reasons. Number one is so that you might have a better understanding of your own experience and why you show up in certain ways. Also, you may be able to detect these behaviors in others around you and offer more personalized support if you better understand what's happening. Sometimes I work with leaders who will tell me, this person on my team is not performing. And I'll ask them, do you think that this is a competence issue? Do you think it's that they don't know how to do the job? Or do you think that it's a confidence issue? Is it that they're doubting themselves? Is it that they have imposter syndrome? Because oftentimes it's not that they're not capable of doing the job, but that they don't believe in themselves or they feel like an imposter, and that's undermining how they're showing up. And so if we understand that, that involves a different approach to supporting them than if it's a competence issue where the better solution would be to just provide them with more training and opportunity to learn new skills. So here are some of the ways in which imposter syndrome shows up. And this is not, a fully comprehensive list, nor is it the case that everybody will experience the same set of, I hate to call them symptoms, right? Because we're not talking about a medical diagnosis here, but we don't necessarily see the same constellation of behaviors in everyone. But really, self-doubt is a big part of this imposter syndrome experience, as we've been talking about, that doubt that I belong in this room, that people have made a big mistake by promoting me into this role. I don't know that I can actually do it. Often it shows up as an unwillingness to speak up or to share our ideas. I often hear from people who say things to me like, well, sometimes when I'm sitting in a meeting, I have an idea, but I'll think to myself, well, if this were a good idea, somebody else would have shared it already. So it ends up resulting in us playing small. We kind of sit on the sidelines. We don't fully engage. We don't share our questions and ideas because we don't believe that we're worthy. It could be a reluctance to take risks. Maybe we don't go for that promotion because we're telling ourselves that we're not ready yet. This often shows up in the form of, I just need one more X, right? I just need one more training, one more degree, one more year of experience. We keep telling ourselves that we're not ready. And then once we do reach that point, we might move the goalposts again and say, well, I'm still not ready. Now I need to do X in order to do that. Perfectionism is a big part of imposter syndrome. They tend to go hand in hand. And what's unfortunate about perfectionism is that most of us intellectually recognize that there's no such thing as perfect, but we expend a lot of energy trying to be perfect. If we're honest with ourselves, often our definition of success means no mistakes at all. It means being perfect in ways that are not achievable. And so what's happening is we're spending a lot of our time agonizing over things that, good enough is good enough. So you might relate to this if you've ever spent extra time rereading an email before you hit the send button, or rereading your PowerPoint slides, right? Really, is the 15th time that you read that email going to be any different than the 14th time that you've updated that email? So a lot of that time that we're spending trying to be perfect could be better channeled either into more productive work activity or into more meaningful activities within our larger lives. Micromanagement can sometimes be an expression of imposter syndrome for a couple of reasons. Number one is that often when we get promoted to a first-time manager role or into a higher level strategic leadership role, we're not given a lot of training and support. There's an expectation that because we were really good individual contributors, we'll be able to be natural leaders, when in fact, the skill sets are very different. And so when we get put into that position, we feel very uncomfortable. We're not sure what we're supposed to be doing. We're afraid to ask for help because if we do, we may reveal that we're not actually qualified to be doing this work. So we tend to retreat to our comfort zones, which looks like the work that got us here in the first place. We want to be productive, and so we'll go back to doing those tasks that we know we can do well. And in doing so, what often happens is we step on the toes of the members of our team who should now be empowered to be doing that work. Similarly, if we have perfectionistic tendencies of our own, we may be applying those same standards to our team, which might look like hovering over them, rereading their emails, right? And if you've ever worked for a micromanager, you know how demoralizing that can be. And then finally, I think it's important to note that there's a spectrum of behaviors here too, because oftentimes we think about imposter syndrome as playing small. But when we see certain types of overcompensating behaviors, sometimes it looks like bullying in the workplace. It might be somebody who needs to be the smartest person in the room, somebody who is inflexible, doesn't listen. That can be a sign of insecurity and imposter syndrome as well. What I always like to say is that true confidence is quiet, right? If you truly believe that you're qualified to be in the role that you're in, that you have a certain area of expertise and that there are things that you don't know and that that's okay too, you don't need to be flexing your muscles in front of everybody. So when we see those kinds of behaviors, sometimes we interpret them as a sign of power, a sign of intimidation. And it doesn't make it any less unpleasant, I should say, to work with people who show up this way, but it can be helpful to our own sense of self if we recognize that when we see those behaviors, it's not a show of strength on the part of that person. What it really shows us is that they are insecure as well. So now I want to shift into what I mentioned before, which is how do we manage this? What do we actually do when we feel imposter syndrome? And I think it's important to note here that there's been a lot of conversation recently about imposter syndrome. There was a recent Harvard Business Review article that some of you might be familiar with called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. There's a lot of controversy around this topic right now. And the premise of that article is that by calling it imposter syndrome, what we're doing is we're denying the fact that much of the reason why women and women of color in particular experience this type of self-doubt and anxiety is a function of deep-rooted structural issues and systemic racism. And that if we call it imposter syndrome, what we do is we pathologize the experience of the individual. We make it their responsibility to solve that problem, which lets the system off the hook. And while I agree wholeheartedly that there are very important changes that need to happen at the macro level, where I land on this topic is that it's a yes and, not an either or. As an individual, as we all know, there's only so much that we can control as it relates to the systems in which we operate. And if we simply shift the focus to changing the system, what do we do about the very real pain that so many people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis? So I believe that absolutely we should be making systemic changes, that we should be honest about what is triggering imposter syndrome. And we should also give very specific strategies that people can be using to manage their experience and be more confident in their workplaces. So a lot of it starts, in my mind, with recognizing what's actually happening when we feel like an imposter. And this was a very big, I would say, aha moment or a turning point for me in my own experience, because I have had a lifelong anxiety disorder. I am somebody who is very tightly wound. I am prone to catastrophizing. I have, a very active fight or flight response. And I have found it really helpful to think of imposter syndrome as really an expression of anxiety. It's really a natural human fear response that shows up when we feel threatened. Our brains are hardwired to be on constant alert for potential threats because that's how we stay alive. That's an evolutionary, sort of adaptation of our brain. And what's true is that our brains don't make a good distinction between the threat of a predator and a social threat like failure, rejection, or humiliation, which are the three things we fear most outside of physical harm. When we experience those three things, they actually activate the same centers in our brain that pain activates. And so we are highly motivated at a very deep and primal level to avoid those. And so you can imagine that when you find yourself in a situation where you have taken on a new responsibility, you've been promoted to a new level, you're looking around and you're seeing all of these other people who seem so much more comfortable or confident in their roles, that's going to trigger you in some way. It's going to activate that part of our brain that tells us you are not safe here. And so what's actually happening when we experience imposter syndrome is that it's an expression of the fight or flight response. That voice, that inner critic that tells you you're not good enough, you're going to fail, you're a fraud, is really a way of getting our attention so that we will remove ourselves from what our brains perceive to be danger and put ourselves back in our comfort zones. What's true about that is obviously there's a benefit to having this radar system or this internal security system, but some of us have more sensitive security systems than others. Some of us have security systems that send off a lot of false alarms. And so we feel like we're in a chronic state of fight or flight. We're chronically feeling like we are in a threat state, when in actuality, the threat is not real. And so what we need to do, or the opportunity that's available to us, is to examine that through a more logical lens. When we are in a fight or flight response, all of our resources get allocated to simply keep us alive. We do not have access to the cognitive part of our brain that allows us to reason, to problem solve, to think more clearly. Oftentimes I'll hear from people who tell me, I don't know what happens to me. It's like I step into this meeting and I lose my ability to form a coherent thought. I can't articulate what I want to say. And finally, after hearing a variation of that same theme, probably 4 times within a 2-week span, I said, you know what? Time out. These are very bright, talented, otherwise capable people. They do not second guess themselves. They do not show up this way when they're with their friends, when they're with their family, when they're with people they trust. What's happening when they enter these spaces is not that they've lost IQ points. It's that they don't feel safe and they've gone into fight or flight mode. And if we don't recognize that that's what's happening, it reinforces our narrative that we're not good enough. So if you're in a room of people that you deem to be so smart and so much more qualified than you are, and then you start talking and you find yourself fumbling over your words, or you can't clarify what it is that you have to say, your first reaction might be, see, I knew I didn't belong in this room. When in actuality, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you are in a threat state. So what's really, really helpful is to have tools available to disrupt that when it happens. If you know your fight or flight response, I know mine all too well because I've been dealing with it for a very long time, you can intervene more easily. First of all, it can be helpful to know what your natural triggers are. Pay attention over the course of the next couple of weeks to when you tend to feel this way. What do you notice? What do you notice about what's going on internally? What do you notice about what's going on externally? Sometimes it's that we just haven't gotten enough sleep the night before and we don't feel well prepared. Sometimes it's that certain personality types trigger us, or we're in certain environments where we don't feel safe because people are critical of each other or they're not inclusive. So if we know what it is that triggers us, then we can anticipate when they might show up. And then if we know that there's a possibility that it can show up, we can come prepared with tools that will help us to ratchet down some of that anxiety. And so the easiest thing to do if you find yourself in that situation is to take deep breaths. I know it sounds cliche, but it's a very important signal to your brain that you are not in a true threat situation. You would not be able to take deep breaths if you were being chased by a tiger in the wild, right? So your brain feels that and says, okay, I can calm down a bit. Another thing that I highly recommend to everyone is to keep a drink with you at all times, because it's a perfect pause button when you find yourself getting triggered, when you find yourself getting activated. It buys you time to take some breaths and compose yourself. You can always just take a sip, take a breath, and kind of bring yourself back to neutral. Another strategy is to pace your speech. Oftentimes, when we're nervous, we speak really, really fast, and then our brains can't necessarily catch up with what we're trying to say. And so it reinforces that sense that I'm in danger, I'm not comfortable here. And it also sends a signal to the people around us that we don't feel comfortable, that we don't feel confident, and they mirror our energy. They feed back to us through their body language, through the way they're interacting with us, that same kind of discomfort that reinforces our feelings. If, however, we pace our speech, if we make an active effort to slow down how we're speaking, it engages the part of our brain that is more cognitive, more logical, it's more intentional, and it gets us out of that more primitive fight or flight response. It also shows others that we're more in command of our message. We feel more in control of the situation. So it allows us to show up more powerfully. So these are some things for you to be thinking about as you're moving through your day. And a longer term, sort of bigger picture strategy is to just think about catching yourself in certain situations that feel anxiety inducing to you and asking yourself, what am I really afraid of here? What is it that I'm worried about? Sometimes we just take our inner critic as at face value without examining it further, and we don't have a chance to tell ourselves a different story. But if you can catch yourself and say, for example, I'm really anxious going into this meeting. What is it about this meeting? What is it that I'm worried about? Maybe I'm worried that I'm going to be asked a question I don't know the answer to. Okay, well, it's very difficult to manage generalized anxiety. It's much easier to manage an actual specific fear. If I say, okay, I'm worried that I'm not going to have an answer to a question I may be asked, that's something I can prepare for. That's something I can plan to have a strategy for if and when it happens, so I feel more in control. And I always recommend that you plan for what you're most afraid of, because if you have a plan for that, everything else is going to feel more manageable. You're going to feel more in control, as I mentioned. Another strategy is to adopt a growth mindset. Some of you might be familiar with this term. A growth mindset is a term that was popularized by Carol Dweck. She's a researcher, and she makes a distinction between a fixed mindset, in which we believe that we're essentially born with all of our capabilities, that if I'm not good at something today, it's just a reflection of the fact that I was born that way. That if I, for example, think that I'm not good at math, I just don't have a math gene, right? I just wasn't born with the aptitude for math. However, if I have a growth mindset, I believe that I get to decide that I may not be good at math today, but if I'm interested in making that investment and growing in that area, I can put more time, more resources, more practice into that, and I can get better. And when we have a growth mindset, we're much less likely to feel like an imposter. We recognize that when we are new to something, naturally it's going to be hard. That we are the only ones who have an expectation that we are going to have mastered a subject or a task on day one. Nobody else around us has that expectation but us. And if we have a growth mindset, it allows us to zoom out. It allows us to recognize that everything that we do well today, all of the strengths and skills that we take for granted, were once scary and new. We were not born with any of the things that we do well today. We got here by going through the discomfort of learning something new. And oftentimes when we're learning something new today as adults, it feels like this time is different. This is going to be the time when I fail. Sure, all those other times were fine, but there's something about this time that is, this time is going to be different for me. And if we can catch ourselves thinking that way, we can zoom out and recognize that every new challenge, every new opportunity is just one incremental step on a journey we've been on our entire lives. That we know how to do this. We may not know the specifics of what it is we're doing today. This might be a new area for us, but we're resourceful. We know how to learn. We know how to ask for help. We know how to grow and change as humans. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Some of you might be familiar with the concept of the power of yet, right? So if you find yourself telling yourself the story that I'm not good at something, to say I'm not good at it yet, because why would I be good at something I've never done before? Why would I be good at something that I haven't practiced before? That's an absurd idea. And so it becomes a choice. Now I get to decide, do I want to get better at this or not? And one of the things that's true, especially for those of us who may identify as perfectionists, is that when we're growing up, we're exposed to a lot of learning opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise chosen. We are given we're required to take certain courses that we might not be interested in or that we feel intimidated by, but we do them anyway. Or we all learn certain life skills, or learning how to ride a bike, things that challenge us, but eventually we get good at that. Once we become adults, we have more power to decide what we do, how we grow, how we challenge ourselves. And if we're perfectionists, we often curate our lives in such a way that we only take risks where we're guaranteed to be successful. And so in doing so, we forget that it's not the end of the world if we make a mistake. It's been so long since we have failed. It's been so long since we've made any kind of a meaningful mistake that it feels so scary and we blow it out of proportion. But in actuality, we don't learn unless we make mistakes. We don't learn unless we do things that we're not good at. And so one strategy is to intentionally put yourself in situations where you have to do something you're not good at yet. And this doesn't have to be in the workplace. You don't have to do this in a board meeting or in a high stakes interaction within your work environment. But think about learning a new language. Think about learning to play an instrument. Think about trying a new physical activity that you've never tried before. These are humbling experiences. They can be fun. They remind us what it's like to be a beginner. And from that, we build those muscles that remind us, oh, okay, it's not the end of the world if I do something scary and new. This next strategy is to own your success. And this one tends to be more challenging for women. It tends to be more challenging for people who come from cultural backgrounds that really value humility and collectivism over individualism. Many of us grew up with messages like it's not polite to brag, right? That we should be thinking of others, not ourselves. It's inappropriate to be celebrating our own success. And so we don't often have language or role models for how to think about ourselves in strengths-based ways. Going back to what we talked about earlier, our brains will always recognize our mistakes, the ways in which we don't feel like we measure up to the people around us, all of the things we don't know how to do, because those are where the potential threats lie. That's what we're constantly scanning for. We don't have an automatic process that recognizes and acknowledges all of the things that we do well. Those types of things we tend to breeze right past, right? We tend to say, oh, yeah, but that's no big deal. Or, oh, yeah, but anybody can do that. But what that person can do, that's special. That's impressive. And so we are often moving along through our jobs. We're taking notice of everything that we feel we're doing wrong, breezing past all of the good stuff. And then we get to our next destination. Again, maybe it's that promotion. And we think to ourselves, how did I get here? It's a complete fluke. I don't belong here. But the reason why we don't believe we belong there is because we did not catalog all of the amazing things that we've been doing along the way that led us to this point. I'm a big believer in the value of self-awareness, in constantly challenging ourselves to be better, to not be complacent, to want to develop and grow in important ways. It's really honorable. It's a sign of good character to be able to say, I have weaknesses in these areas and I want to address them. That is an important part of the human experience. However, I also believe that we owe it to ourselves to balance out that self-awareness with an unapologetic acceptance of the fact that we already have strengths. There is absolutely nothing shameful about recognizing that we have strengths. That is the raw material that we bring to our work, to our families, to our communities, that allows us to be of service to others. And the better we understand what those skills and strengths are, the more intentional we can be about sharing them with other people. Most of us want to maximize our impact. We want to ensure that we're adding value. We want to make sure that we're making the best possible contribution. If we don't believe that we have strengths, if we don't know what those strengths are, we cannot do that in the most effective way. So, this is a big part of the process. I highly recommend that you keep an accomplishments journal, that you write down every day 3 to 5 bullets of what you have gotten done during the day. Don't overthink it, because you will start to say, and I hear this all the time, well, does that belong on the list? I'm just doing my job, right? There's nothing special about that. I'm just doing my job. No, you're not just doing your job. You're doing your job in your own unique way. And if you weren't there, that would not get done. It's an important thing to acknowledge. So you can put on your list proud moments, things that you're celebrating, problems that you've solved, anything you've crossed off your to-do list. Nothing is too small. Get into the habit of writing it down and find a system that works for you. If every day feels like too much, do it every couple of days, but don't go more than a week, because you won't remember. And then what you're going to have is you're going to have a document that has a lot of practical benefits. For one thing, it's going to be really helpful to you when you have to do your performance evaluation, when you have to update your resume, when you want to ask for a promotion or a raise, to have all of this information at your fingertips. Do you even remember what you did last week, let alone what you did 6 months ago, right? We don't remember these things. We don't remember them in enough detail to be able to adequately package them and share them with other people. If you keep this running log, you're going to have great material that you can repurpose in important ways. From a confidence perspective, it's really important, because what it allows you to do is to have a resource that you can turn to on days when you're doubting yourself, when you're questioning, am I adding any value at all? And now you can go to this document, which is not in your own head, right? So your brain is looking at it as an external objective source, and you're reading through these pages, and you start to realize, like, wow, I'm doing a lot more than I thought I was. You can't chalk that up to luck. You can't call that a fluke. And I think about it like a gratitude journal. So some of you might have a practice where you write down every day what you're grateful for. That practice over time literally changes the way your brain sees the environment. You train your brain to scan the environment for the positive, because you're looking for things to write down every day. Similarly, if you are writing down every day what you're doing well, you are training your brain to think about yourself in a more strengths-based way. And that leaves less bandwidth for all of the negative things that we're paying attention. So another strategy that I recommend, because we are so quick to judge ourselves, is that when you come out of a meeting, when you come out of a project, when you come out of any interaction where you're beating yourself up and saying, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I didn't say that. Oh, I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. Is to be very proactive about asking yourself the question, but what went right? What am I proud of? What did I do well? Because again, we are so quick to go down the path of what went wrong and to never acknowledge what went right. And so if you insert these habits, insert these practices of really balancing the good with the bad, then your brain will start to do that more naturally, and you will have greater perspective on your strengths. And then finally, this was a big game changer for me. When I was working in high tech, I mentioned at the start that I had found myself in this role. I was a partner manager. So my job was to manage relationships with software vendors that integrated their software with our products. So my role was to ensure that the relationship was meeting its goals, to, handle sort of all of that, the personal side of the business, and connecting them with the resources that they needed. However, I had told myself the story that in order to be an effective partner manager, I needed to understand everything about the technology and needed to be able to go head to head with an engineer who had years of education and training that I didn't have. It's almost like believing that you need to know every aspect of how a car works in order to drive it. This was the story I was telling myself, and I never felt like I measured up. I would sit in meetings, and as I mentioned before, I felt so exposed, so vulnerable. I felt like it's only a matter of time before people figure out that I don't belong here. So eventually I reached a point where I said, I have to solve this problem. I can't continue on like this. And my first thought, and many of you may be able to relate to this, I think those of us who are achievers tend to really like academic solutions to these problems. I thought, I know, I'll go back to school. I'll get a master's in software engineering, and then I'll be able to communicate with these colleagues of mine. So I actually took 3 courses before I realized that is not going to work for me. My plan B was to reach out to a very senior level executive who led the entire engineering organization. And I sat down with him and I very candidly said to him, sometimes I feel like I'm in a little bit over my head in these technical conversations. Do you think I should get an engineering degree if I want to advance my career in this company? And he looked at me funny and he said, an engineering degree? You don't need an engineering degree. You're surrounded by engineers. He said, you don't need to, know that. If you need a technical person, bring a technical person. If you need to have a technical conversation, bring a technical person into the room with you. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know what you don't know and build relationships with people who have those skills. And I remember walking out of that room and thinking 2 things. My first thought was, oh, what a relief, right? Relationship building I can do. That was my job. That was my natural personality. I can build relationships with people who have the skill sets that I don't have. The other thought that occurred to me was I had never, not in my resume, not in my interviews, not in any conversation that I had had with a single person in my organization, had I ever promoted myself as a technical person. Yet they invited me to the meetings anyway. It's not as if I was lying to people and telling them I had a skill set I didn't have. They still kept including me in these conversations, and it made me realize there must be another reason why I'm here. A reason that does not include competing with Bob from engineering, who has 20 years of experience that I don't have and frankly don't want. And that shifted everything for me because I was able to then start to think about, okay, well, if it's not that reason, what is the reason that I was invited into this room? And as soon as I could focus on that, as soon as I could say, okay, I'm here to represent the partnership. I'm here to ensure that we are meeting the obligations of our contract, that I'm representing my team, that I'm making sure that I'm asking good questions that will help us from that perspective, I could show up with strength. I could stop feeling like I was inadequate. And that's something I really want to encourage all of you to think about too. This was at the heart of my TEDx talk that I gave last year called How to Bring Your Diverse Voice to the Workplace, because so often we feel like we are there to compete with other people as opposed to being a complementary member of the team. We tend to think that, I often use the analogy of a Swiss Army knife, right? That has all the little tools baked into it. We often think I need to be every tool in the Swiss Army knife when I'm working, as opposed to I need to be 1 or 2 of those tools. And then my team will round out the other tools. The team is the Swiss Army knife, right? And if I can get to the point where I can say, oh, thank God Bob knows that, so I don't have to, I can focus on what I know. It takes so much of the pressure off. And there are times in our workplaces where we don't know why we've been invited into the room. We don't have a clear understanding of what is the agenda? What is the purpose of this meeting? Why was I specifically invited? Ask those questions. Don't feel obligated to attend a mystery meeting. You're not going to show up at your best. You're going to feel unprepared. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to feel vulnerable. Ask the question ahead of time. What is the goal of this meeting? How can I best contribute? What would you like me to prepare? And then you can decide from there, what is the most effective way for you to show up given your specific slice of the business. You're going to feel so much stronger as a result. So I have a free resource that I'd love to share with anybody who's interested. If you want to go deeper, I have what I call a 7-day challenge. Every day for 7 days, you'll get an email with some self-reflection questions, some exercises that you can do to help you better understand your own experience with imposter syndrome and to develop some of these strategies and tools that will help you rethink your own experience and manage it more effectively. You're welcome to visit the link here. I'm also always interested in connecting with people on LinkedIn. It's my most active platform. And you're welcome to connect with me there. Feel free to email me if you have questions that we haven't talked about, or to simply reach out to me. Sorry, I'm going to stop the share here, by email. And I would love to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was really enlightening. And I will be joining the 7-day challenge. I'm really interested in that. We've got a couple of comments on here from Nathaniel Schuler. Why am I not good at this yet? Well said, Kim. And brilliant explanation. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is great for this.
I'll have to check that out. I love that. I'm always looking for real world ways to describe what I'm talking about. So thank you for that, Nathaniel.
No problem. Absolutely delighted to have you here today, Kim. And I hope everyone enjoyed it today. We're going to take a very short break now and be back with our next session at 3 o'clock. That will be live streamed on our website and on the Legacy Media Hub YouTube channel, and in the Overcoming Imposter Syndrome group on Facebook. So please keep engaging with us, keep the conversation going on our social media channels. Use the hashtag IISAD2023. And let's keep the conversations going around imposter syndrome. Kim, thank you so much again for being with us today and taking part. And we'll see you all back again at 3 o'clock. Thank you.